Welcome back to Proof or Potion, the podcast where we sift through the science of everyday health hacks, myths, and mysteries. I'm your host, Morgan.
And I'm Dr. Keely. Today we're diving into a fresh study on caffeine, yay, and anxiety, not so yay. Specifically, how a modest dose affects people with panic disorder versus those of us who just get the usual jitters.
Right, because who hasn't felt their heart race after that third cup and wondered, am I anxious or is this just a lot of coffee talking? We're going to break down this new research plus some backstory on why caffeine has been flagged as potential anxiety trigger.
Morgan, did you know that caffeine is the world's most popular psychoactive substance?
I actually, sort of did, right? Because many moons ago, I worked at Starbucks and I used to tell the new employees that we were legal drug dealers and we were never to get in between a customer and their morning fix.
It's true. I know I sure like my morning cup or three. But back to the science. Caffeine works by blocking adenosine receptors in your brain, which ramps up alertness, but can sometimes mimic stress responses such as faster heartbeat, heightened awareness. For most people, that's a perk. But for those with anxiety disorders, especially panic disorder, it can feel like pouring gas on a fire.
Panic disorder involves sudden, tense panic attacks. So think chest tightness, dizziness, fear of losing control, and ongoing worry about when the next one might hit. And to put that in perspective, panic disorder isn't rare. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, about 2.7% of the US adults deal with it in any given year. And it's more common in women compared to men. That means millions of people are navigating these really intense episodes that often start in their late teens or 20s. On top of that, early research has suggested that caffeine could exacerbate panic disorders.
Back in the 1980s and 90s, researchers like Charney and colleagues pioneered these challenges. They'd give participants oral doses of 400 to 480 milligrams of caffeine, roughly equivalent to 4 or 5 strong cups of coffee, about 100 milligrams each, or a couple of energy drinks. In healthy folks, it might cause mild anxiety or restlessness, but in people with panic disorder, it triggered full-blown panic attacks in 50 to 70% of cases. A 1985 study found that 71% of PD patients panicked after 480 milligrams compared to 0 in controls. This helped scientists understand that PD's biology. Caffeine amps up norepinephrine and other stress chemicals, which PD brains might be hypersensitive to.
I've definitely had days where too much coffee made me feel shaky and on edge, but definitely nothing for me ever close enough to a full-blown panic attack. So these studies basically showed that caffeine was a reliable panic provoker at a high dose.
I do want to mention here really quickly that the half-life of caffeine, which is the time it takes for concentrations in the blood to be half their peak amount, is around 5 hours for a healthy adult, but can be as little as 1.5 hours and as long as 12 hours. So it isn't necessarily how much you are drinking, but the time that could be a factor of how quickly you're consuming it.
Okay, so does that mean my morning cup of coffee could be like staying with me all day? I guess that makes sense that researchers were using such high doses in a short period of time to really see and test the effects of caffeine on anxiety then, right?
Yeah. But really, how many of us are out here chugging 400 milligrams of caffeine at once? In my clinical experience, normally daily intake is more like 102 milligrams, 1 to 2 cups, and then additional throughout the day. In this study, researchers tested a much more realistic 150 milligram dose, which is about 1.5 cups of coffee.
All right, so let's go ahead and unpack this 2025 study from the Journal of Psychopharmacology titled Acute Effects of 150 Milligrams of Caffeine on Subjective Physiological and Behavioral Components of Anxiety in Panic Disorder and Healthy Controls. Researchers were from Sweden and they were led by Johanna Hope. They wanted to see if everyday caffeine levels cranked up anxiety in people with panic disorder more than in healthy individuals.
As someone who has anxiety, I sure want to know if my morning cup is affecting me like that. This was a randomized, placebo-controlled crossover trial, gold standard style. They recruited 29 people with mild to moderate panic disorder and 53 healthy controls, mostly young adults who weren't heavy caffeine users. Each participant did 2 sessions, one with a 150 milligram caffeine pill, one with placebo. They were randomized. Everyone was blind to what they got. After taking the pill, they waited 30 minutes for it to kick in, then did 2 tasks. First, an emotional reactivity task. This is where they looked at pictures of faces, either fearful, happy, or neutral, which were paired with sounds like screams or laughter. This measures how your body responds to emotional cues. Second, an approach avoidance conflict task. So imagine choosing between two doors on a screen, one safe but boring, and when you click on it, there are no rewards given. The other could be something scary, like images of crowds or injuries, something that could trigger panic disorder fears. But when you click on it, you win points as a reward. This tests whether or not you are willing to be uncomfortable for the sake of a reward, or you would rather play it safe and not get anything. During both of these 2 tasks, they measured 3 things: self-reported anxiety and focus on body sensations, physiological arousal via skin conductance, basically how sweaty your palms get as a stress indicator, and behavior, like how often you avoided the risky doors.
Kind of sounds like a video game version of real life, right? Where you have decisions and you like have to make them. And, maybe you want to skip a crowded party because you have anxiety, even if it means not being able to be part of the fun. So it's super relatable for anyone who's ever bailed on plans after a rough day, which is me all the time.
Precisely. And the results surprisingly tame compared to those high dose studies from the past. The caffeine did not spike self reported anxiety differently in PD patients versus controls. Overall, anxiety was higher in the PD group as expected, but the 150 milligrams didn't widen that gap. Only one panic attack occurred in a PD participant after caffeine during the emotional task. Physiologically, caffeine boosted arousal, stronger skin responses to all faces, but equally in both groups. Behaviorally, it made everyone more avoidant, about 35% less likely to pick the rewarding but scary options. Again, no PD specific effect. Even on body awareness, PD folks naturally tune into heartbeats or breaths more, interpreting them as danger. Caffeine caused a bit more distraction overall, but didn't exaggerate it for them.
So this really does seem like the results are more akin to real life, right? So meaning there aren't such big swings in both the mental and physical responses to caffeine in the 150 milligram range as we had seen in those old studies that were 100 plus, which is kind of reassuring for coffee lovers like me with like a little bit of anxiety. But it did, it did make people more cautious, right?
For sure. So let's talk implications. The bigger picture behind these results is that it is suggesting a dose response curve. A dose response curve, although it seems sort of obvious, means that individuals react differently at higher and higher doses. Higher caffeine, like 400 to 480 milligrams, could be a real risk for those with panic disorder, potentially mimicking or triggering attacks by overstimulating the sympathetic nervous system. But at 150 milligrams, it's more subtle with universal effects such as heightened alertness and avoidance, but without targeted panic worsening.
So, this means for panic disorder management, the blanket quit caffeine recommendation is probably a little bit overkill, and that there really is a safe amount of caffeine for these individuals that won't exacerbate their condition. Some might handle a morning cup fine, and others might not. And an interesting side note here is that looking at this, the study sort of highlights how caffeine could indirectly maintain anxiety by encouraging those avoidant behaviors. So, like skipping out on things that you know will be challenging just to stay in your comfort zone, which can create kind of a perpetual cycle of avoidance and lead to potentially increased anxiety in the future.
And at the end of the day, as with so many things, it's not one size fits all. Genetics play a role in caffeine metabolism. If you're sensitive, even 150 milligrams might feel like more. Some people change throughout life.
So, our takeaways from this study: high dose caffeine of 400 plus milligrams or more can provoke panic attacks in individuals with panic disorders, as proven in decades worth of studies. But everyday amounts, like 1 cup, probably not a major trigger, though they do promote caution that might feed anxiety long term. So, with that, I think, what do we say? Like, proof or potion? Does caffeine cause increased anxiety and induce panic attacks?
I wish that in this study they would have done a dose curve because we have these older studies they saw these panic attacks at 400. And in this study, they didn't see it at 150. They also had one individual who did have a panic attack in the caffeine group. How many participants were in each group? 30 people. So yeah, one person out of 30. That's a small percentage. But if it was induced by the caffeine, we don't know. But, that I think there's still a bit of concern there. And obviously it does still contribute to these behaviors. Personally, I've experimented with this as somebody who's had anxiety my entire life. I don't tend to struggle with panic attacks. I've had them related to mold specifically, is the only thing that has ever induced a known panic attack for me. Is being exposed to like a lot of mold. But with normal everyday caffeine, I have gone on, months long detoxes to see if it changed my anxiety, and it changed absolutely nothing for me. Yeah. And so I've tried all kinds of things, but caffeine for me was not a factor. And I've never been a heavy caffeine user either. I've never been at that 500 milligrams a day level. If anything, I've maybe had 300 milligrams max throughout 5 or 6 hours. How about you?
I mean, I am a solid coffee drinker for
I
sure.
love coffee.
Yeah, it's like one of my favorite things. Having my morning ritual with my husband and like having my cup of coffee is like that is like the most important part of my day. So I will probably never give up coffee. I can say that when I drink too much, I get quite shaky and I feel that sense of like, oh, I'm like almost out of control, but definitely, yeah, not really full panic. But also, I would say I have like very mild anxiety at this point in my life. I've had moments where it's much worse.
Same. I would agree with that. Yeah. I'm currently in a place of very mild, just like subliminal anxiety that usually has to do with external factors outside of my control. And I just love coffee. I love matcha. I love caffeine. Not even necessarily for like the caffeine, but for the ritual, for the bitter, for like the hot on a cold morning, for the antioxidants, and just everything about it.
It's good.
And I've tried even like tea replacements and mushrooms, and I always go back to the coffee. I just love a really good cup of coffee. So I think this is great. But
Yeah, it's a great study. And I like that it kind of like walks back the recommendation like we do. And I've totally, recommended this in our teaching clinic, right? Of avoid coffee at all costs, right? For patients that do have higher anxiety
or
and
certain conditions. It's not great for like
sure.
certain gut conditions and things where,
Yeah,
it's
and
not good for everybody.
always such a bummer for patients when they're like, wait, but I don't
One of the hardest
that. Yeah,
recommendations we could ever make.
it totally is. And so to kind of be able to walk this back a little bit and be like, actually, it might not be as bad as we thought it was. Of course, we need more information. We need longer studies. We need more people. I think it's really interesting how they actually like tested people with the fear response and the delay in activity choices. Yeah, kind of a really interesting way to test this.
Yeah, and that's always a challenge with mental health is how do you test people? Obviously, if someone goes into a panic attack, that's a fairly clear response. If you're giving them a survey or doing these emotional cues or triggers, they also did the skin sweat. So that was more objective to look at the sympathetic response. And so I think they did a good job with what they could. The only other thing would maybe be to look at the brain and see if the amygdala is lighting up or
changes.
There was some type of, enhanced activity in the brain maybe. But yeah, I enjoyed this study.
Yeah.
I think it suggests you could potentially experiment, right? Yes. Because if you're doing 1 cup, that's 80 milligrams on average of caffeine. That's half of the dose they used in the study. So if you need that 1 cup or those 2 cups, potentially might not be an issue.
Get away with it.
Yeah. So
awesome study. Thanks for finding that for us.
Last thought, the avoidance piece was also interesting that the caffeine made people more avoidant and not want to be social with anxiety by saying if you are more avoidant and not wanting to do those things, then it's an anxiety response versus, or like less likely to do the hard to get the reward. I guess we have learned that caffeine, what was it with the ADHD study? It was something about slowing the
response time.
Yeah, right.
Like the buzzer response with the functional MRI, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When they took the caffeine without the theanine, because we looked at caffeine, L-theanine, and both together, and both the caffeine and L-theanine separately were causing like increased mind wandering. So if you're like, should I go out tonight? And like, do I want to make myself do that, or do I want to motivate myself to do the hard thing and get the reward? It's kind of fascinating that this substance you think of as increasing your stimulating and increasing your, ability to be productive and work could actually be making your mind wander more and make you more
Yep.
avoidant. That's really fascinating to me.
Well, thanks for joining us today. Let us know, how does caffeine work for you?
What do you think? Leave us your comments. We want to hear them.
Yes.
We would love to hear everybody's experience. Everybody's got an opinion on it. So give us yours, please. And if you got any value from this video, please like, share, subscribe. Check out our other videos on evidence-based natural health.
We will see you next time.
See you next time.